This is the episode of Theoretical EU versus LPL Rift Rivals, where I'm going to need the alcohol. Guys, it's not booze this time, it's actually coffee. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm gonna need the pick-me-up. Specifically, it's really depressing for me to see teams like RNG and G2 in third for their regional power ranking for Rift Rivals when they had really stellar spring seasons. I mean, I maintained that there was a rock, paper, scissors between RNG, WE, and EDG, with these kinds of matchups working out the way they did. WE kind of countering RNG, and you can make the loop. G2, of course, only really lost the one best of 3 the entire split to Team Rocket, so it's a little bit of a weird situation. Even weirder, though, is that even though these two teams had really weirdly different styles, like RNG were the aggressive 1-3-1 team, G2 were, much more of the maintain lower pressure, wait for an opportunity to teamfight sort of situation, and reactive, very reactive team. Okay, so I think that these two scenarios are interesting because they've had weirdly similar problems or weirdly aligned problems. Yeah, you heard that correctly. I'm comparing G2 to a Chinese team again. When it gets right down to it, I think that there are 3 things in this matchup that are really going to make the difference. Okay, so I could talk about a bunch of different things, but since I sort of want to limit my time, I'm going to focus primarily on jungle mid. I mean, we're talking about G2, and I already mentioned jungle mid and whatever else. The way that top lane interaction is kind of working for G2 and the way that RNG have changed theirs, and then finally how teams are using side lanes as the game progresses, and what that means in terms of closing out the game and things like this. We know that MLXG is going to Rift Rivals, and when MLXG has played for Royal Never Give Up this split, the team has been really reliant on Xiaohu. Xiaohu to get leads and have mid priority. They tend to give him side lanes or pick things up from there, and it feels like Xiaohu is winning the game for them or nothing. And that's really weird and depressing to see from a team that used to have multiple lane threats. It's also depressing because it feels like RNG don't really understand this completely, so they're willing to pick more arrogant Syndra picks because Syndra is a really big pick for Xiaohu in the losing matchups and things like this, and it's just kind of it's like they're suddenly a one-trick team, and it's just probably the biggest problem that they have. Even more bizarre, they've gravitated away from using Let Me, and they're using Coral 1 and picking him up in much more situations than I would frankly expect. Maybe it's because, I don't know, they had a difficulty with late game team fights, or Let Me just made them a little bit predictable with a lot of snowballing. Coral 1 can be left to his own devices. He's much more used to that as a top laner, and they've been doing that a lot. Or maybe it's something else entirely, but MLXG, you would think, after this, if they change the top laner, and they aren't really ganking top as much as they did with Let Me, that he would have a lot more freedom, but really he's just kind of up to his old tricks. He just puts himself behind and in really bad situations for level 2 ganks that don't necessarily get a whole lot for his team, or are unnecessary, or are in matchups that they would win or lose anyway without his interference. Then he just gets put in positions where he's levels down and he's not in a good position for team fights or for being able to skirmish level 1, and he can have a lot of problems against enemy junglers that want to set up and counter jungle and take his creeps and just make him fall even further behind. This was an issue for RNG for sure during Spring Split, and so it's still an issue now, and I don't really understand what exactly they're trying to accomplish with the new top laner or anything of that nature, if they think that having Coral 1 will free him up more, or what the situation is, but the fact that MLXG is going to Rift Rivals just means that these problems that RNG have always had will remain consistent. This is pretty different from some of the stuff that Trick does. I would say that Trick's problems are more that he's always had kind of the freedom to get full clear. He's had pretty reliable laners, especially with Perks, who's pushed out a lot. And it's more like he doesn't necessarily recognize or take the opportunity to punish the enemy jungler or to look for gaps and things that are happening. If he has the opportunity to take a Raptor camp, he's more happy to not really take advantage of the Lucian. Like, why are we playing the Lucian if we're not freely entering the jungle and things like this? So when you have more of these like pushing lane setups, I feel like G2 doesn't know how to take advantage of them to the fullest. Instead, when there are situations where Trick can get an advantage or can do something with the league, he's looking almost MLXG-esque and ganking mid a lot, and that's a really interesting strategy. But it means probably that a lot of this G2 and RNG matchup is going to matter a lot on the 2v2 mid and jungle. So I can kind of tell you how this is going to go. MLXG is going to go for a level 2 gank after taking a couple camps, and depending on the matchup or how predictable he is, which is really obvious, then Xiaohu will get ahead and snowball from there, and the game can be really swingy in that regard. Or, you know, they'll just pick these kind of prideful Syndra picks, the losing matchup. I feel like Xiaohu and Perks have had kind of similar storylines where they had really, really great spring seasons. Of course, it wasn't Xiaohu's debut, but that was really when he started learning from Mata and things like that last spring. And then really kind of lackluster and disappointing summer splits where they went really downhill, but then they came back into their own. They sort of became the MVPs of their team going into the summer season, and they've been really, really cornerstones in that regard. So on the G2 side, I feel like this is still going to be G2 favored because, unfortunately, right, you have RNG being really reliant on this point and still maybe getting not necessarily the best matchup. If MLXG puts himself into a negative situation, Trick isn't going to do that, right? Trick is always going to be able to get back into the game sort of with a higher farm value or higher XP, so if there are recurring mid 2v2 skirmishes, RNG will probably start to lose those just because of how much MLXG is going to try to give up in an attempt to have this kind of impact. I mean, there's a reason why I expect facepalms a little bit, right? He's not necessarily always aware of the map trades or what a team might do in response to his team making a play on one side of the map, and he doesn't necessarily keep up with the jungle rotations, and I'm not, like, things like just really bizarre reactions or attempts to make this up. Like I said, there's a reason he does the facepalm thing. The problem is that I don't really see RNG in their current form doing that. They're much more happy to just like have Core 1 get pressured to have an impact in teamfights later and maybe have that sort of comeback, but that's not how you want to play the game against G2. When you have these openings that G2 leave in the early game or in the first 20 minutes or something like this, first 20 minutes, that's really how you kind of look to play around them if you're RNG. Now, you can't really talk about G2 Esports without talking about Sven. He likes to play these hyper carries, the Twitches, the Kog'Maws, things like this, and a lot of times the reason why G2 can fall behind in the early game is because they're willing to make kind of large trades to make sure that Sven gets farmed and can have an impact later on so that they can make some of these like really, really big Baron trades or some of these really, really big reactive plays. So they can give up turrets, they can give up pressure in multiple lanes just to kind of see what Sven can do and then hope that he can turn around and have a really large impact on the game. You would think that RNG would be able to avoid the types of situations and the types of setups that I'm talking about because they were known kind of as the 1-3-1 team at the LPL. They get really good advantages on their solo laners, and then they can snowball the game from there. They are good with their lane assignments through mid-game, and then they close out without necessarily taking these really large fights, unless they have a really massive lead. Now, that should be able to counter the situation where Sven is really ahead with the Kog'Maw and things like this, unless he's playing a sort of pick comp Twitch and stuff like this. But there's actually a joke among LPL fans, which is that RNG don't play 1-3-1. They play 2-3. And this was something that, if you watched the LPL final against WE, cost them there, and it's something that sort of has persisted into this season when they play Let Me. I'm not really sure what the deal is or why Let Me is constantly like either teleporting or walking to Xiaohu's lane. I think they have this philosophy where they can get the picks and pressure the side lanes there, but if they don't set them up properly or they're not aware like of things like teleports and other cooldowns, it can actually make situations go really sour for Royal Never Give Up and throw their leads really significantly and really easily. The problem is that for me, this is the crux of G2's advantage. They're really good at defending their vision line and to make sure you don't know when they're setting up a flank. So the moment that there's vision of someone on the team out of position, G2 can make these really amazing flanking reactive plays on the rest of your team. And this is when the extra gold, the extra farm, and everything else on Sven and Trick really pays off. And this is how G2 get back into their crazy games. Of course, like they then transition to Baron, everything else happy, going smoothly. This is how they win their games. And I feel like if you're going to do the thing with Let Me and Xiaohu constantly doing side pick collapses, they're not necessarily paying attention to the enemy video line, not necessarily paying attention to the enemy setup. This is where they're really going to get in trouble, and it's like the final nail in the coffin, right? It's the final nail in the coffin for RNG in this matchup. So if you've been keeping track, you're not really surprised to hear me say I think that G2 are pretty favored here. The problem is that I think both of these teams are really struggling, and there are a lot of issues with both teams that I've really not touched on. I think that there's a lot of initiative that can be taken by Ming to really make this comeback turnaround play. I think that RNG's team fighting, probably as a product of Core 01, has gotten a little bit better, so there's always that, but just G2 being a little bit set in their ways or just not necessarily having the best traits. Like, expect low map awareness isn't the only thing. They'll have low pressure on sides, and if RNG really punish that or look for really strong pick setups in that regard, or even look for Sven himself in his low pressure lane, I think that they do have a chance just because of how inconsistent both of these teams have been so far and how sad it is to see. But I do think that G2 are actually pretty heavily favored for round one. So first part goes to Europe.